At the emergency room registration desk, I noticed the form listed my son as my husband's primary decision maker and under my name. It simply said, emergency contact. I just nodded and handed the clipboard back. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end. And tell me which city you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels, because that night, under fluorescent hospital lights, I realized something in my own home had been quietly rearranged without me knowing. The automatic doors kept sliding open and closed behind me, letting in bursts of cold November air. It was 2:14 a.m. The kind of hour when the world feels suspended, when even the highway outside sounds distant, like it belongs to another life. My husband, Harold, had collapsed in the kitchen. One moment he was rinsing a coffee mug. The next, he was gripping the counter like the room had tilted. I remember the sound the mug made when it hit the tile. A sharp crack, then silence. 43 years of marriage. And I had never seen fear in his eyes until that night. The paramedics came quickly. Our neighbor, Mr. Collins, stood barefoot on the lawn in his bathrobe, asking if I needed anything. I shook my head. I didn't even remember dialing 911. At the hospital, everything moved efficiently, too efficiently. A nurse asked for identification, insurance, medication list, allergies. Then she glanced at her screen and said, almost casually, your son has already been here. He completed most of this online. I blinked. Already been here? Yes, ma'am. He arrived about 30 minutes ago. I had not called my son. Daniel lives 25 minutes away, without traffic. It was after 2 in the morning. The nurse turned the monitor slightly toward me. We just need you to confirm the decision hierarchy. Decision hierarchy. I watched her scroll. Primary decision maker, Daniel Whitmore, son. Secondary, N.A. Emergency contact, Margaret Whitmore, spouse. Spouse. Emergency contact. I have been Harold's wife since 1981. I know the rhythm of his breathing when he sleeps. I know how much sugar he sneaks into his oatmeal when he thinks I'm not looking. I know the scar behind his left shoulder blade from a high school football injury he never talks about. But on that screen, at 2:14 a.m., I was just an emergency contact. I didn't protest. I signed where they pointed. Because this was a hospital. Because dignity matters in public spaces. Because I was raised to never make a scene. And because I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Daniel must have acted quickly. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he was trying to help. That's what good sons do. A nurse guided me toward the waiting area. The chairs were molded plastic, bolted to the floor. A television in the corner played muted news footage no one was watching. A vending machine hummed beside me, glowing blue like something artificial and indifferent. I folded my hands in my lap. Harold had always handled paperwork, investments, trust accounts, retirement funds. He used to joke that I married him for his spreadsheets. But in truth, we built everything together. This house. The small rental property on Oak Street. The savings account that took decades of careful discipline. Daniel grew up in that house. He learned to ride a bike in our driveway. Harold ran beside him, one hand hovering behind the seat, never quite letting go, even when Daniel thought he had. I used to believe that was what parenting meant. Hovering, protecting, letting them believe they were steering. At 2:32 a.m., Daniel walked through the double doors. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't look panicked, either. He looked composed. Mom, he said softly, leaning down to kiss my cheek. You made it. You made it. As if I were the late arrival. I came as soon as the ambulance left. I said. He nodded. I've already spoken to the attending physician. They're running cardiac panels. It might have been a mild arrhythmia. He said it like a report. Clean, structured. When did you get here? I asked. I was in the area. He replied, adjusting his coat sleeve. In the area. At 2 a.m. I studied his face. The same brown eyes Harold has. The same faint crease between his brows when he concentrates. I wanted to see fear there. Or relief. Or something that matched the gravity of the moment. Instead, I saw calculation. I filled out the authorization forms. He continued, just in case. Just in case. Forms? I asked. For medical decisions. Financial continuity. You never know how these things go. Financial continuity. The phrase landed strangely. This was about Harold's heartbeat. And my son was talking about continuity. I thought it would be easier if everything was streamlined. Daniel added, less stress for you. Less stress for me. A nurse approached, asking Daniel to step aside for a moment. She needed to confirm a signature. Not mine. His. I watched as he followed her toward a counter. He leaned slightly over the paperwork. The pen moved quickly. He didn't look back at me. I turned my gaze toward the hallway where they had taken Harold. For decades, when something happened, a broken furnace, a leaking roof, a late mortgage payment in our early years, Harold and I stood side by side. We were a unit. Now, under fluorescent light, I felt like I was standing slightly behind my own life. At 3:05 a.m., a different nurse returned Harold's belongings in a clear plastic bag. Wallet, wedding ring, cell phone, and his coat. Keep these safe, she said. I took the bag. The coat felt heavier than it should have. Daniel was still speaking quietly with someone near the nurse's station. His back was to me. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of Harold's coat, meaning only to check for his reading glasses. Instead, my fingers brushed against something small and rigid. I pulled it out. A black USB drive. No label. No keychain. Just matte black plastic. I stared at it for a moment. Harold barely knows how to attach a PDF to an email. He prints everything. Folders, tabs, physical copies. He does not carry USB drives. Mom? Daniel called gently from across the room. They're going to let one of us see Dad for a few minutes. One of us. I closed my fingers around the USB and slid it into my purse. I'll go, I said calmly. Daniel hesitated, just slightly, before nodding. Of course. Of course. As I followed the nurse down the hallway, I realized something quiet and unsettling. I had rushed to the hospital thinking I might uncover an affair. Because what else explains secrecy? Sudden calls? Quiet conversations? My son arriving before I even knew what was happening. But the detail on that registration screen. The way the hierarchy had already been arranged. The way my role had been reduced with clinical efficiency. That was not about romance. That was about replacement. When I stepped into Harold's room, machines beeped softly around him. He looked pale, but conscious. His eyes met mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw something there. Not guilt. Not confusion. Urgency. His gaze flicked briefly toward my purse. Then back to me. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. But in that sterile hospital room, holding a USB drive I didn't understand, I felt the first crack in something I had always believed was unbreakable. And it wasn't my marriage. It was my trust in my own son. When I stepped back into the waiting area, Daniel was standing by the window, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, controlled. Yes, he's stable for now, he said. We just need to move quickly. Move quickly. He turned slightly when he saw me, lowering his tone even more. I didn't ask who he was speaking to. I didn't need to. The hospital at 3:18 a.m. has a way of amplifying words that shouldn't be said aloud. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. How is Dad? He asked. Awake, I replied. Tired. Daniel nodded, as if he had expected that answer. I sat down again, folding my purse carefully in my lap. The USB inside felt heavier now. Not physically, just present. The television in the corner switched to weather updates. A cold front was moving across the Midwest. Temperatures dropping overnight. It felt appropriate. Daniel sat beside me, but not close enough for our shoulders to touch. You don't need to worry about paperwork, he said after a moment. I've already handled most of it. There it was again. Handled. Since when do you handle your father's medical decisions? I asked gently. He didn't bristle. He didn't get defensive. He smiled. Mom, you've been overwhelmed lately. I just thought it would be easier if I took the lead. Overwhelmed. I thought about the last few months. The small things. The way Daniel had started insisting on reviewing our monthly expenses. The way he asked for copies of our insurance policies, just to organize them digitally. The afternoon he mentioned assisted living communities, casually, as if we were discussing vacation options. You don't want to wait until there's a crisis. He had said then, planning early is smart. I had laughed it off. Harold and I still mow our own lawn. We drive ourselves to church on Sundays. I bake lemon bars for the neighborhood potluck. We are not fragile porcelain. But sitting there under fluorescent lights, I replayed those conversations in my mind. Each one felt harmless at the time. Together, they formed a pattern. Daniel stood again when a nurse called his name. Not mine. His. He walked confidently toward the consultation desk. Shoulders straight, posture assured. He looked like a man accustomed to making decisions in boardrooms. I watched him sign something. Again. When he returned, I asked quietly, "What did you just authorize?" "Just preliminary consent forms," he said, "standard procedure." He reached for my hand. I let him hold it. His palm was warm, familiar. This is the same hand I once guided across kindergarten worksheets. The same hand I held when he cried after losing his first Little League game. I searched his face. There was no malice there. Not openly. Just certainty. "Mom," he said softly, "if Dad's condition changes, we may need to make quick choices about financial access. Hospitals can freeze accounts temporarily during extended treatment." Financial access. The words did not belong in that room. Why would accounts need to be accessed? I asked. For continuity, he repeated. Mortgage payments, utilities, investment transfers. He spoke like a consultant delivering a forecast. I thought of Harold's coat hanging over the hospital chair in his room. The hidden USB in my purse. The way his eyes had flicked toward it. A crack widened inside me. "You seem very prepared," I said. Daniel gave a small shrug. "I believe in being proactive." Proactive. That word, too, had surfaced before. Last month, he had suggested we consolidate our assets under a single oversight structure. Just in case, he even recommended a financial advisor, a friend of his. At the time, I felt proud. What a responsible son, I told myself. Now, under hospital lighting, pride began to feel like naivety. At 3:47 a.m., the cardiologist came out to speak with us. Mild arrhythmia, monitoring overnight, further testing in the morning. Stable. The word loosened something in my chest. Daniel asked the questions, detailed ones, about long-term prognosis, medication management, risk factors. I stood beside him, nodding when appropriate. But inside, I felt something shifting. After the doctor left, Daniel exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "See," he said, "we're on top of it." On top of it. I realized then that he wasn't reacting to an emergency. He was operating within a plan. A plan that predated tonight. When visiting hours ended, Daniel insisted on driving me home. "It's almost 4, he said, "you shouldn't be alone." The house felt different when we stepped inside. Too quiet. The kitchen light was still on from when Harold collapsed. The broken coffee mug lay in the trash. Shards wrapped in paper towels. Daniel walked through the living room, glancing at the framed photos on the wall. "Our equity here has grown significantly," he said absent-mindedly. "The market's strong right now." I looked at him. "Is that what you're thinking about?" He paused, then smiled faintly. "I'm thinking about what's best for both of you." Both of you. As if Harold and I were already a unit to be managed. Daniel poured himself a glass of water without asking. He moved comfortably through the kitchen. Too comfortably. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow might be busy." Busy. I watched him set his glass down on the counter, the same counter where his father had collapsed just hours earlier. When he left, he locked the front door behind him. Locked it. I stood alone in the hallway for a long moment. Then I walked to the dining table and placed my purse on the polished wood. Slowly, deliberately, I removed the black USB drive and set it in front of me. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the windows. Inside, the house felt unfamiliar. I had spent 43 years building this life. Tonight, I began to wonder who had been quietly redesigning it behind my back. I didn't open the USB right away. I made tea first. Chamomile, 2 bags instead of 1. It was 4:26 a.m., and the house felt like it was holding its breath. The kitchen clock ticked louder than usual. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Ordinary sounds, familiar sounds. But nothing felt ordinary. I sat at the dining table where Daniel had just stood hours earlier talking about equity and market value. As if our home were already a listing. The USB lay in front of me. Small, unmarked. Harold's coat had never hidden secrets before. I wrapped my fingers around the drive and walked slowly to the study. Harold's desk was neat as always. Bills stacked in labeled trays. A yellow legal pad with his careful handwriting. He still writes grocery lists in cursive. I sat down in his chair. For a moment, I hesitated. Because opening that file meant crossing a line. It meant admitting that something was wrong. Not with my marriage, not with Harold. With my son. I plugged the USB into the laptop. The screen lit up quietly. One folder appeared. No name, just a date from 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Before tonight. My throat tightened. I clicked. Inside were scanned documents. Power of attorney forms. Medical directive drafts. Financial authorization templates. All partially filled out. Daniel's name typed cleanly into the primary agent section. My name absent. Not secondary. Not alternate. Absent. I didn't feel anger first. I felt clarity. There was also an audio file. I hovered over it for several seconds before pressing play. Static. Then voices. Harold's voice, lower than usual. Tense. I'm not signing anything without Margaret reviewing it. Daniel's voice followed. Calm, controlled, persuasive. Dad, Mom doesn't understand this stuff. If something happens to you, everything will freeze. We need to be proactive. Proactive. That word again. She'll panic. Daniel continued. Let me handle it. I'll protect her. Protect her. There was a pause. Then Harold spoke. Quieter. Not without her. The recording ended. I leaned back in the chair. My son wasn't trying to replace me emotionally. He was trying to replace me legally. I closed my eyes for a moment. 42 years ago, I held Daniel in my arms for the first time in a small hospital room not far from where Harold was lying now. He had tiny fingers and a stubborn cry. I promised him safety. I promised him loyalty. I never imagined I would one day need protection from him. The house creaked softly as the heating system turned on. Dawn was beginning to stretch pale light across the living room carpet. I stood and walked slowly through the hallway, touching familiar things. The framed photo from Daniel's college graduation. The dent in the wall from when he practiced baseball indoors. The oak cabinet Harold built by hand the year Daniel turned 10. This house was never just property. It was memory layered over memory. And somewhere along the way, my son had begun seeing it as leverage. At 5:12 a.m., my phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. Mom, I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor tomorrow afternoon. It's important we align everything while Dad is being monitored. Align everything. I stared at the words. He wasn't reacting to a crisis. He was accelerating a timeline. Another message followed. Also, the hospital may need formal documentation about decision authority. I've got it handled. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked back to the study and opened another document on the USB. A draft email from Daniel to someone named Mark Reynolds. Subject: Transition Planning. The body read: If we can activate POA within the next quarter, asset restructuring will be smoother. The house should be evaluated before market conditions shift. Evaluated. Before market conditions shift. My hands were steady now. steadier than they had been in the waiting room. This wasn't panic. This was strategy. Daniel had been planning this for months. And Harold had resisted. Which meant Harold knew. Which meant the look he gave me in the hospital room wasn't confusion. It was warning. At 6:03 a.m., the sun rose fully over the neighborhood. Light spilled across the hardwood floors. The same floors Daniel had crawled across as a toddler. I closed the laptop. I did not cry. I did not call him. I walked into the bedroom and opened the small fireproof box Harold keeps in the closet. He showed me its location years ago, laughing, saying, "Just in case I forget everything else." Inside were copies of our original will. And a note in Harold's handwriting. "Margaret, if you're reading this unexpectedly, check the external drive." He had underlined external. I sat on the edge of the bed. So he knew. He suspected. He prepared. And he chose not to confront Daniel directly. Why? Because confrontation would fracture the illusion. Because Daniel would deny. Because once you accuse your own child of calculating against you, something permanent breaks. The front yard sprinkler system clicked on automatically at 6:30 a.m. The normal rhythm of morning resumed as if nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted. At 7:02 a.m., Daniel called. "Morning, Mom," he said lightly. "How are you holding up?" His voice sounded warm. Familiar. Carefully balanced. "I'm fine," I replied evenly. "I'll pick you up at noon to review some documents." He continued. "It's important we don't delay." "Don't delay." "I'll let you know," I said. There was a small silence on the line. Then he asked, "You trust me, right?" "Trust." I looked down at the USB drive resting on the nightstand beside me. "I've always trusted you," I answered. And for the first time in my life, that sentence felt incomplete. By noon, Daniel was already in my driveway. He didn't text to ask if I was ready. He simply arrived. His car door shut with a quiet thud, precise and controlled, just like everything else about him lately. I watched from behind the lace curtain in the living room as he checked his watch before walking to the front door. He rang the bell once. Not impatient, just assured. I opened the door slowly. "You look tired," he said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited. "You didn't sleep." "I slept enough," I replied. That wasn't entirely true. I had spent the morning reviewing every document on that USB. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just carefully. Daniel placed a leather portfolio on the dining table, the same table where I had laid out holiday dinners for decades. The same table where he once spilled cranberry sauce at age 8 and cried because he thought I'd be angry. I wasn't angry then. I'm not angry now. I'm observant. "I've arranged for a temporary financial authorization," Daniel said as he opened the folder. "Purely precautionary. Dad's condition could change. His cardiologist said it was mild." I replied. Daniel nodded, but didn't look at me. "Yes, but complications can escalate. It's about being prepared." Prepared. There it was again. He slid a document toward me. Durable power of attorney. His name printed neatly in the primary agent line. "This just ensures bills get paid without interruption," he said smoothly. "Mortgage, utilities, investment accounts." "Who drafted this?" I asked. "A colleague recommended someone," he answered. "It's standard." Standard. Nothing about replacing a wife of 43 years felt standard. I ran my finger lightly along the edge of the paper. "You seem very certain this needs to happen immediately," I said. Daniel exhaled gently, like a man explaining something simple. "Mom, I'm thinking long-term. You and Dad worked hard for everything. The last thing we want is chaos." "We." He had started using that word frequently. "We need to move quickly. We should align assets. We don't want disruption." But I had never agreed to join that "we." I looked at him carefully. "When did you first start drafting these documents?" I asked. He paused, only briefly. "A few weeks ago," he said, "just in case." Just in case. The same timeline as the USB folder. I nodded slowly. And Dad knew about this? Of course, Daniel replied. He just didn't want to burden you. Burden. I folded my hands on the table. For decades, I said calmly, your father and I have made every major decision together. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And I respect that, he replied, but things change. Things change. He leaned forward slightly. Mom, you don't need to manage this stage of life alone. Let me take responsibility. Responsibility. He said it as if it were a gift. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen window. Giving myself a moment, the sunlight fell across the backyard where Harold once taught Daniel how to throw a football. Responsibility. That same word had once meant cleaning his room. Now it meant legal control. Daniel remained seated. He didn't rush me. He knew pressure works better when it's subtle. I turned back toward him. Daniel, I said quietly, what exactly are you preparing for? He blinked once. For contingencies, he answered. That's not what I asked. The room went still. For the first time, a faint edge appeared in his expression. I'm preparing for the reality that you and Dad are getting older. He said carefully, and if something happens suddenly, I don't want to scramble. Scramble. Like I had scrambled at 2:08 a.m. when Harold collapsed. You've already spoken to a financial advisor. I continued. His eyes flickered. Yes, he said, briefly. And you've discussed restructuring assets. His shoulders straightened. Mom, where is this coming from? I walked back to the table and placed the USB drive in front of him. He stared at it. For a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, his breathing changed. Your father carried this in his coat, I said. Silence. Daniel did not reach for it. You recorded that meeting, I continued softly, the one where you said I wouldn't understand. His composure wavered. That was taken out of context. He replied quickly. No, I said evenly, it wasn't. The air felt heavier now. Not loud. Not explosive. Just undeniable. I was trying to protect you. He insisted. Mom, you don't handle financial stress well. I thought about every mortgage payment I tracked during the early years. Every budget spreadsheet Harold and I reviewed late at night. Every tax season where I organized receipts while Daniel slept upstairs. I have handled this family's finances for decades. I said quietly, with your father. Daniel's eyes hardened slightly. This isn't about capability, he said. It's about efficiency. Efficiency. There it was. The language of restructuring. Of management. Of transition. Not of family. I picked up the unsigned power of attorney and folded it once. Your father is alive, I said. He is stable, and I am not incapacitated. Daniel stood up. You're overreacting, he said, a hint of frustration slipping through. I'm the only one thinking ahead. No, I replied calmly. You're the only one accelerating. For the first time since he arrived, Daniel looked unsure. What does that mean? He asked. It means, I said evenly, that I will speak to our own attorney this afternoon. His jaw tightened again. That's unnecessary. Nothing involving legal authority is unnecessary. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he gathered his portfolio slowly. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I walked him to the door. I'm making it deliberate, I answered. He paused at the threshold. Mom, he said, voice lower now, trust me. I looked at him. Really looked. At the man who once ran to me with scraped knees. The man who now saw my home as an asset class. I do, I said quietly. Then I added, just as calmly. But trust is not a substitute for transparency. Daniel left without another word. I closed the door gently. And for the first time since Harold collapsed, I felt something steady inside me. Not fear. Not anger. Resolve. I didn't wait. After Daniel left, I changed my blouse, tied my hair back neatly, and drove downtown. The law office Harold and I had used for years sat on the second floor of a brick building across from the courthouse. The brass plaque on the door still read, Bennett and Rowe, Estate and Trust Planning. We had updated our will there 15 years ago. Back when Daniel still called before coming over. I didn't have an appointment. But when I told the receptionist my name, she gave me a look that lingered a second too long. "Mr. Bennett can see you," she said quietly. That alone told me something. Mr. Bennett stood when I entered his office. He had more gray hair than the last time I saw him. But his handshake was steady. "Margaret," he said gently, "I was wondering when you might come by." "Not if." "When?" I sat down. "You've spoken with my husband recently," I said. He nodded once. "Yes." I didn't ask how recently. I placed the USB drive on his desk. "He recorded something," I said. Mr. Bennett didn't look surprised. "Harold requested documentation safeguards 2 weeks ago," he said calmly. He was concerned. Concerned. The word didn't sting. It clarified. "Concerned about Daniel," I said. Mr. Bennett folded his hands. "Your husband noticed increased urgency from your son regarding restructuring, particularly around property titles and financial authority." Property titles. Financial authority. The same phrases Daniel had used. "Did Harold sign anything?" I asked. "No," Mr. Bennett replied firmly. He refused. He insisted all decisions remain joint unless you were fully informed. I exhaled slowly. So the resistance I heard in the recording had held. "He mentioned you might not be aware of the pace being suggested." Mr. Bennett continued. "He wanted time." Time. That was all Harold had been asking for. Time to speak to me. Time to prevent something from being rushed. "I assume Daniel approached you as well," Mr. Bennett added carefully. "He did not," I replied. "He went elsewhere." Mr. Bennett's jaw tightened slightly. "That aligns with what Harold suspected." I leaned forward. What exactly was my son trying to do? Mr. Bennett didn't dramatize his answer. He proposed activating a durable power of attorney early. He also inquired about transferring your primary residence into a revocable trust with himself as co-trustee. Co-trustee. Why? I asked. To streamline asset management in the event of medical decline. Medical decline. Harold had experienced one arrhythmia. 1. Was there any immediate necessity? I asked. No, Mr. Bennett said simply. Silence filled the office for a moment. Outside the window, traffic moved normally. People crossed the street holding coffee cups. Life continued. Inside that office, something foundational shifted. Margaret, Mr. Bennett said gently, your son framed his approach as protective. But the timing suggested acceleration beyond medical necessity. Acceleration. That word again. Daniel wasn't responding to crisis. He was creating momentum. What are my options? I asked. Mr. Bennett opened a folder already prepared. Options. Prepared. Harold had not been idle. You can reinforce existing joint authority clauses. Mr. Bennett explained. Add financial exploitation protections. Specify that no asset restructuring occurs without dual consent and independent counsel. Independent counsel. In other words, not Daniel's advisor. I nodded. And if someone attempts to override that? I asked. Then the clause activates disinheritance of authority. Mr. Bennett replied calmly. The room felt very still. Not emotional. Legal. Clear. I thought of Daniel sitting at my dining table hours earlier, speaking about efficiency. Prepare the revisions, I said quietly. Mr. Bennett studied my face. You're certain? Yes. He slid paperwork toward me. As I signed, my hand did not shake. Not because this was easy, but because clarity has a stabilizing effect. When the documents were complete, Mr. Bennett leaned back slightly. Your husband trusted your judgment, he said. He believed you would see what he saw. I closed the folder. I should have seen it sooner, I said. Parents rarely do, he replied gently. That sentence lingered with me as I left the office. On the drive back home, I passed the elementary school Daniel attended. The playground was empty in the afternoon heat. I remembered waiting in that parking lot decades ago, watching him run toward me with a backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He used to wave. He used to look relieved to see me. Now he looked strategic. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was not there. The house stood quiet. I stepped inside and placed the revised documents on Harold's desk. Then I sat in his chair and allowed myself one long breath. Not grief. Not outrage. Understanding. At 4:17 p.m., my phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. Have you signed the POA yet? The advisor is available tomorrow morning. I looked at the screen for several seconds. Then I typed. No, I met with our attorney instead. There was no immediate reply. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then my phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering. Mom, Daniel said, his voice tighter now. Why would you do that without telling me? I leaned back in Harold's chair. Because, I said evenly, I prefer decisions made in daylight. Silence. You're making this adversarial, he said. No, I replied calmly, I'm making it balanced. Another pause. You don't trust me, he said quietly. I looked around the study. At the framed family photos. At the years layered into every corner of this house. I trust actions, I answered. The line went silent again. And for the first time since this began, I sensed something shifting, not in me. In him. Daniel did not come over that evening. That told me more than if he had. When he was confident, he showed up unannounced. When he was certain of his position, he filled the room with words like proactive and efficient. Silence, from him, meant recalculation. Harold remained in the hospital overnight for observation. The cardiologist reassured me it was precautionary. Monitoring, medication adjustments, nothing catastrophic. At 8:12 a.m. the next morning, I drove back to the hospital alone. The waiting room looked different in daylight. Less dramatic, less ominous. Sunlight filtered through wide windows, softening everything that had felt harsh at 2 a.m. But clarity doesn't fade with daylight. It sharpens. Harold was sitting upright when I entered his room. Pale, yes, but alert. You went to see Bennett, he said quietly before I could speak. I smiled faintly. Yes. He nodded once. I wasn't sure how to tell you, he admitted. You don't have to tell me everything alone, I replied. For a long moment, neither of us mentioned Daniel's name. But it hung between us. He's not evil, Harold said eventually. I know, I answered. That was the complicated part. This wasn't cruelty. It was control. Harold looked toward the window. He started pushing hard about 6 weeks ago, he said. Property retitling, early activation clauses, said we were behind. Behind. As if aging were a project timeline. I told him we would review it together. Harold continued. He didn't like that. Of course he didn't. Daniel preferred acceleration. Why didn't you tell me? I asked gently. Harold exhaled slowly. Because once you say your son is maneuvering around you, you can't unsay it. He was right. Accusations against strangers can be repaired. Accusations against your child fracture something permanent. I recorded the meeting, he added quietly, in case. In case. We had both underestimated how necessary that phrase would become. At 10:37 a.m., Daniel walked into the hospital room. He paused slightly when he saw both of us awake and sitting upright. He smiled. How's my favorite patient? He asked. Stepping forward. Harold gave a small smile in return. I've had better mornings, he replied. Daniel glanced at me. There was caution in his eyes now. Not fear. Calculation. I spoke with the advisor again. Daniel began. Given everything, we should finalize documentation this week. I did not interrupt. Harold looked at him directly. We won't be finalizing anything without joint counsel, he said calmly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Dad, this isn't about mistrust, he said. It's about preparedness. It became about speed, Harold replied. Silence settled over the room. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, pause, beep. Mom met with Bennett, Daniel said. Looking at me now. Yes, I answered evenly. And? And we reinforced our protections, I said. His expression shifted, barely, but enough. You didn't tell me, he said. I don't need permission to speak to our attorney, I replied calmly. The air grew heavier. I was trying to protect both of you, Daniel insisted. Harold looked at him for a long moment. Protection doesn't bypass consent, he said quietly. That landed. Daniel stepped back slightly, folding his arms. You're making this adversarial, he said again. No, I replied, steady. We're making it transparent. Transparency. A word he had not used once. Daniel paced once near the foot of the bed, then stopped. You're overestimating the risk, he said. You think I'm trying to take something. I studied his face. I think, I said carefully, that you were preparing to control something before it was necessary. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. Because he couldn't deny that. Not entirely. The monitor beeped steadily between us. Harold cleared his throat. Daniel, he said quietly, why the rush? That question lingered. Why the rush? Not whether. Why? Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly. Markets shift, he said after a pause. Medical costs spike. I didn't want to be caught flat-footed. Flat-footed. This was the language of business. Not family. You didn't trust us to manage our own timeline, I said. Daniel's eyes flickered. You're both aging, he replied, softer now. I don't want chaos. Chaos. That word again. I stood slowly. Then let me be clear, I said. We will not be rushed. We will not be restructured. And we will not be managed. Daniel looked between us. For the first time, uncertainty edged into his expression. I never meant for this to look like a takeover, he said quietly. But it did, Harold answered. Silence again. Not explosive. Just undeniable. After a long moment, Daniel exhaled. Fine, he said. We'll slow down. Slow down. That was all we had asked for from the beginning. He leaned down and kissed Harold's forehead. Then he looked at me. I hope you still trust me, he said. I held his gaze. I trust behavior, I replied. He nodded once. This time, when he left the room, he did not look assured. He looked thoughtful. And as the door closed behind him, I realized something important. The power shift had already happened. Not because I shouted. Not because I accused. But because I refused to be quietly replaced. Harold was discharged 2 days later. Mild arrhythmia, medication adjusted, follow-up scheduled in 3 weeks. The hospital sent him home with printed instructions and a reminder to avoid stress. I almost laughed at that. Daniel offered to drive us home. We declined. Harold insisted on sitting in the passenger seat of our own car. He held the discharge envelope on his lap like something ceremonial, like proof that he was still here. The house felt different when we walked back in together. Not fragile. Guarded. Daniel followed behind us carrying a small overnight bag. He set it down in the hallway without comment. I'll stay for a few days, he said, just to make sure everything runs smoothly. Runs smoothly. Harold and I exchanged a glance. That won't be necessary, I said calmly. Daniel paused. It's not an imposition, he replied. I know, I answered, but it's not necessary. There was a difference. He didn't argue, he just nodded and placed the bag back in his car. That was new. The old Daniel would have insisted, persuaded, layered his reasoning until resistance felt unreasonable. Now, he recalculated. That evening, Harold rested in the recliner while I prepared a simple dinner. Grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, nothing complicated. Daniel arrived just before 6. This time with takeout containers from a restaurant downtown. I figured you wouldn't feel like cooking, he said, setting them on the counter. I already did, I replied evenly. He glanced at the stove. Oh. It wasn't confrontation. It was contrast. We sat at the dining table together. 3 plates, 3 glasses of water. For years, this table had held loud holidays. Laughter, Arguments about politics. Stories from Daniel's business trips. Tonight, it held something quieter. Daniel spoke about market trends again. Interest rates. Healthcare projections. Harold listened politely. I watched. Because there was something else in Daniel's tone now. Less confidence. More testing. He was measuring how much authority remained within this house. After dinner, Harold excused himself to rest. Daniel stayed seated. Mom, he said carefully, I know you think I was moving too fast. I didn't respond immediately. I think you were moving without us, I said. He leaned back slightly. I've seen families collapse over delayed decisions. He continued, assets tied up, court battles. I didn't want that. You didn't ask what we wanted, I replied. His jaw tightened again. You don't always see risk coming, he said. That sentence landed differently this time. Because now I understood. Daniel wasn't trying to harm us. He was trying to control variables. Control removes uncertainty. But it also removes agency. I see risk, I said calmly. I simply choose when to address it. He studied me. Perhaps for the first time not as his mother, but as a stakeholder. At 8:14 p.m., Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and quickly turned it face down. A small gesture. But I noticed. Everything all right? I asked lightly. Yes, he replied, just the advisor. Of course. Tell him, I said evenly, that we won't be restructuring anything this quarter. Daniel looked up sharply. You've already decided that? Yes. With Dad's condition. With Dad's condition, I interrupted gently. We focus on health, not liquidation. Liquidation. The word hung in the air. Daniel didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply exhaled slowly. You think I was planning to sell the house, he said. I think you were planning for the option, I replied. Silence. Outside, the sprinkler system clicked on again, sending arcs of water across the lawn Daniel once ran across as a child. I built my life from nothing, Daniel said suddenly. I don't wait for problems to happen. And I built mine from something, I answered softly, from patience. He looked at me then, not defensive, not persuasive, just conflicted. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. And the man he had become. I never meant to sideline you, he said quietly. But you did, I replied. He nodded once. That acknowledgement mattered more than apology. Because it was honest. Later that night, after Daniel left, Harold joined me in the study. Did he push again? Harold asked. No, I said. He tested. Harold smiled faintly. He gets that from me. No, I replied gently. He gets it from both of us. We sat in comfortable silence. The revised legal documents rested in the desk drawer now. Signed, secured, clear. No dramatic showdown had happened. No shouting. No threats. Just boundaries. The next morning, Daniel sent a short message. Let's revisit everything after Dad's follow-up. No rush. No rush. That was new. I stared at those two words for a long time. Not because they solved everything, but because they marked a shift. He no longer controlled the timeline. We did. And in families, control over timing is often control over power. I didn't reply immediately. I waited. Because for the first time in weeks, I understood something clearly. Sometimes the strongest move isn't acceleration. It's stillness. 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly. Harold followed his new medication schedule with the discipline of a man who refuses to be reduced. Morning walk around the block. Light breakfast. No caffeine after noon. Daniel called once each evening. Brief, measured, careful. How's Dad's pulse? Any dizziness? Did you review the hospital billing portal? He no longer mentioned restructuring. He no longer mentioned advisors. But control doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it retreats. On Friday morning, at 9:42 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Almost. Mrs. Whitmore? a woman's voice asked. Yes. This is Karen from Reynolds Financial. I was told to expect documentation from your household regarding the property evaluation. Property evaluation. There it was. Not gone. Paused. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, I said evenly. A short silence followed. Mr. Daniel Whitmore indicated the home would be assessed this week. She continued politely. We have a preliminary comparative market analysis ready. Comparative market analysis. In plain language, pricing. How recent was that discussion? I asked. Tuesday afternoon, she replied. Tuesday. The day after he agreed to slow down. Thank you for letting me know, I said calmly. No evaluation has been authorized. Another pause. I'll make a note of that, she answered. When I hung up, I didn't feel surprised. I felt confirmed. Harold was in the backyard trimming a small hedge when I stepped outside. Daniel spoke to Reynolds again, I said. Harold stopped mid-cut. Recently? Tuesday. He lowered the shears slowly. He told us no rush. Harold said. Yes, I replied. He didn't tell them that. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The same lawn Daniel once measured with a tape to calculate how large a pool could be. He had always thought in projections. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen counter. The USB drive was still in the drawer beside the sink. I didn't need to open it again. The pattern was clear. At 11:18 a.m., Daniel called. Mom, he began lightly. I just wanted to check in. I spoke to Reynolds Financial this morning, I said calmly. There was a fraction of a second of silence. Oh, he replied. They must be moving automatically. They were expecting documentation, I continued. He exhaled softly. It's preliminary, he said, just exploring options. Exploring options. While telling us there was no rush. Exploring requires consent, I said evenly. Mom, it doesn't commit us to anything, he replied, a hint of impatience returning. It commits us to momentum, I answered. He didn't respond immediately. I could almost hear the mental recalibration. I just don't want you blindsided by market shifts, he said. You mean like being blindsided by paperwork? I replied quietly. Silence. Is this about the USB again? He asked. It's about alignment, I said, between words and actions. His tone cooled slightly. You're reading too much into it. No, I replied. I'm reading exactly what's there. Another long pause. Then he spoke more slowly. You think I'm trying to move you out? I didn't answer right away. Because the truth wasn't that simple. I think, I said carefully, you were preparing for a version of our life that we had not agreed to. He sighed. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I replied. I'm making it deliberate. That word again. Deliberate. Daniel's voice softened slightly. I'm not your enemy, he said. I never said you were, I answered. But I'm not your project either. That landed. He didn't argue. For a moment, we just listened to each other breathe through the phone. I'll call Reynolds and pause everything, he said finally. Thank you, I replied. Not triumphant. Not sarcastic. Just factual. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. This wasn't a dramatic showdown. There was no shouting. No threats. Just repeated attempts to accelerate a future we hadn't chosen. In the afternoon, Daniel sent a short message. Reynolds has been informed. No action pending further discussion. Further discussion. At least now, the timeline belonged to us. That evening, Harold and I sat on the back porch as the sun lowered behind the trees. You handled that well, he said softly. I handled it clearly, I replied. He smiled. Clarity. That had become my anchor. I used to think strength meant defending loudly. Now I understand it differently. Strength is refusing to be moved before you're ready. Inside the house, the dining table sat untouched. No documents spread across it. No portfolios. No urgency. Just quiet. And for the first time since that night in the emergency room, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief. Not victory. Control of pace. And in families, pace determines direction. Daniel was still my son. That had not changed. But something else had. He now understood that authority in this house did not transfer automatically. Not because of age. Not because of strategy. And certainly not because of speed. It transferred only with consent. And I had not given it. Sunday came quietly. Too quietly. For years, Sunday dinner had been tradition. Not elaborate, not performative, just steady, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, something sweet afterward. Daniel texted that morning. Want me to come by tonight? We should talk properly. Properly. I read that word twice. Invite him, Harold said from his recliner. But not to negotiate. To talk, I replied. And that was the difference. Daniel arrived at 6 sharp. No portfolio this time. No folders. Just a bottle of wine. That's new, I said lightly as I opened the door. He gave a faint smile. Figured we could have a normal dinner. Normal. We both knew that word had shifted meaning lately. The table was already set. 3 plates, 3 glasses, the same as last week. But something in the air felt steadier. Not tense. Defined. Daniel sat across from me this time. Not beside. Interesting. I spoke to Reynolds again. He began after we'd served ourselves. Everything's paused. Harold nodded once. Good, he said. No applause. No gratitude ceremony. Just acknowledgement. We ate for several minutes in silence. The kind of silence that used to feel uncomfortable. Now it felt deliberate. I need to say something, Daniel said finally. I looked up. I underestimated how this would feel to you. He continued. I saw risk. I saw inefficiency. I didn't see displacement. Displacement. That was closer to the truth. You weren't wrong to plan, I said calmly. You were wrong to bypass. He nodded slowly. I didn't think of it as bypassing, he admitted. But it was, Harold said. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just absorbed it. That mattered. Because the earlier version of this conversation would have included charts, forecasts, data points. Tonight, it included reflection. I've watched friends' parents lose everything because they waited too long. Daniel said quietly. I didn't want that for you. And we don't want chaos either, I replied. But there's a difference between protection and control. He looked at me carefully. I never intended to push you out, he said. But you were preparing to step in before we stepped back, I answered. The words settled between us. He exhaled slowly. Yes, he admitted. There it was. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just honest. Harold leaned back in his chair. You raised a son who thinks strategically, he said. That's not a flaw. Daniel's eyes softened slightly. But strategy without consent feels like takeover, Harold added. Daniel nodded again. He was listening now. Not calculating. Listening. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The house felt warmer. Less guarded. Daniel looked around at the framed photographs. You know, he said quietly, I always assumed this house would eventually become part of my responsibility. Responsibility. The word had changed meaning over the past week. It might, I said evenly, eventually. But not preemptively, Harold added. Daniel gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. Fair, he said. That word felt different. Fair. Not efficient. Not proactive. Fair. At 8:03 p.m., Daniel's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen and didn't flip it face down this time. He silenced it. That's Reynolds, he said, following up. And? I asked. And I told them to close the file. I held his gaze for a moment. Not because I doubted him. But because confirmation matters. Thank you, I said. He shrugged slightly. I got ahead of myself, he admitted. Ahead. Yes. That was the entire issue. He had moved ahead of us. Not maliciously. But unilaterally. I'm not trying to manage your lives. He added quietly. Then don't, I replied gently. He smiled faintly. Deal. We sat together for a few more minutes, the television playing softly in the background. No spreadsheets. No legal documents. Just family. When Daniel stood to leave, he paused near the doorway. I know I pushed too hard, he said. You did, I replied. But I understand why, I added. That surprised him. You do? Yes, I said. You're afraid of losing control. He stared at me for a moment. Then nodded. That's true. And we're afraid of losing autonomy, Harold said from behind me. The symmetry of that statement settled everything. Control. Autonomy. Both rooted in fear. Different directions. Same origin. Daniel stepped forward and hugged me. Not quickly. Not formally. Fully. I don't want to be your adversary, he said quietly. You're not, I answered. But you're not our supervisor either. He laughed softly at that. No, he said, I'm not. When the door closed behind him, the house didn't feel threatened anymore. It felt recalibrated. Harold walked over and stood beside me. That went better than expected, he said. Yes, I replied. Not because Daniel surrendered, but because he understood. The power shift wasn't about winning. It was about clarity. And clarity had finally reached him. The next morning, I opened the desk drawer and looked at the revised legal documents. They were still there. Signed. Protected. Not needed for battle. But present as boundary. And that, I realized, was enough. The week after that Sunday dinner felt almost ordinary. Almost. Harold attended his follow-up appointment on Wednesday. The cardiologist confirmed what we already suspected, mild arrhythmia. Manageable with medication and monitoring. No immediate risk. No emergency trajectory. Stable. That word carried more weight now. Because it didn't just describe Harold's heart. It described our home. Daniel drove us to the appointment. But he didn't walk ahead of us into the clinic like he had before. He stayed beside us. Not leading. Not directing. Just present. In the waiting room, he handed Harold a bottle of water without comment. He didn't speak to the receptionist about documentation. He didn't ask about authorization hierarchy. That silence said more than any apology. After the appointment, we stopped for coffee at a small cafe across the street. Daniel paid without making it a gesture. Harold chose a corner table. For the first time in weeks, no one mentioned finances. No one mentioned advisors. Instead, Daniel asked about Harold's garden plans for spring. Harold spoke about tomatoes, about adjusting irrigation lines, about replacing the old fence panel near the back corner. Ordinary things. Life things. And Daniel listened. Not analyzing. Listening. When we returned home, Daniel lingered near the driveway. Mom, he said quietly, I've been thinking. I waited. I move fast because I'm used to fixing things before they break. He continued, but I forgot that not everything is a system to optimize. I looked at him carefully. You treated us like a project, I said. He didn't deny it. Yes, he replied. There was no defensiveness now. Just recognition. I never meant to erase you from the decision chain, he added. Decision chain. The phrase felt technical. But honest. You didn't erase me, I said calmly. You just assumed my role could be reassigned. That landed gently. He nodded. I see that now. That sentence mattered more than any reassurance. Inside the house, Harold was adjusting the thermostat slightly, something he's done for decades without asking anyone's permission. Small autonomy. But autonomy nonetheless. Daniel glanced toward the front door. I canceled the advisor contract, he said, not paused. Cancelled. I studied his face. There was no performance in it. Why? I asked. Because if we revisit anything in the future, he said, it should be your idea first. That was new. Not strategic. Respectful. I nodded once. Thank you. He smiled faintly. I still worry, he admitted. That's allowed, I replied. But worry doesn't authorize control. He let out a quiet laugh. No, he said, it doesn't. That evening, after Daniel left, I sat at the dining table with Harold. No paperwork spread out this time. Just 2 cups of tea. You think he means it? Harold asked. Yes, I said. Not because Daniel had surrendered, but because he had recalibrated. Control had not vanished from him. It had been redirected. The next few days unfolded steadily. Daniel called, but not with urgency. He asked about medication schedules. He asked if we needed groceries. He asked if Harold wanted help adjusting the garden bed this weekend. He didn't ask about equity. He didn't ask about valuation. He didn't ask about transfer clauses. On Friday afternoon, I opened the desk drawer again and reviewed the revised legal documents. They remained untouched. Power of attorney reinforced jointly. Financial exploitation clause activated if bypass attempted. Dual consent stipulation secured. I closed the drawer gently. Not because I expected battle, but because boundaries are strongest when they're quiet. On Saturday morning, Daniel arrived with gardening gloves and a bag of mulch. No briefcase. No leather portfolio. Just practical work gloves. Harold handed him a shovel. They worked side by side in the backyard, adjusting soil around the tomato plants. I watched from the kitchen window. For a moment, I saw 2 versions of him layered together. The boy who once dug holes too deep. The man who almost dug into documents too soon. Growth isn't dramatic. It's incremental. That afternoon, Daniel came inside, dirt on his sleeves. Mom, he said lightly, I'm thinking about refinancing my own place next year. I raised an eyebrow. Planning ahead? I asked. He smiled. Yes, but not accelerating. That earned a small smile from me. Later, as the sun lowered, Harold joined me on the porch. You handled this well, he said again. I handled it clearly, I replied. Clarity. That word had guided every step. I didn't confront in anger. I didn't accuse publicly. I didn't escalate. I simply refused displacement. And in refusing, I shifted the balance. Daniel still thinks strategically. He always will. But now he understands something he didn't before. Authority in this house is not inherited early. It is entrusted when time and consent align. As the evening settled in, the sprinkler system clicked on again. Water arced across the lawn in steady rhythm. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Just a pattern operating at the right pace. And for the first time since that night in the emergency room, I felt something solid return. Not control. Not dominance. Mutual recognition. And sometimes, that is stronger than any legal document. A month passed. Not dramatically. Not ceremonially. Just steadily. Harold adjusted well to the medication. His follow-up tests showed improvement. The cardiologist reduced his monitoring frequency. Manageable, he said again. Manageable. That word no longer triggered urgency in Daniel. It seemed to steady him too. Sunday dinners resumed their normal rhythm. Not tense, not overly careful, just familiar. Daniel still arrived on time. But he no longer surveyed the room like a consultant evaluating assets. He sat. He ate. He asked about ordinary things. One evening, as we cleared plates together, he paused by the sink. Mom, he said quietly, can I ask you something honestly? You just did, I replied lightly. He smiled faintly. When you found out what I was doing, did you think I was trying to push you out? I dried a plate slowly before answering. Yes, I said. He nodded once. I wasn't, he said. I know, I replied. That surprised him. You do? Yes, I said. You were trying to control what frightened you. He leaned against the counter. I don't like uncertainty, he admitted. I know, I said again. Daniel has always tried to eliminate risk before it appears. As a child, he checked his backpack 3 times before school. As a teenager, he mapped out college applications in spreadsheets. He didn't wake up one day and decide to take over our lives. He followed his instinct too far. I should have talked to you first, he said quietly. Yes, I answered. There was no edge in my voice. Just fact. He looked down at his hands. I thought if I waited, something would happen and I'd be blamed for not acting. There it was. Not greed. Not malice. Fear of failure. Fear of chaos. Fear of being the son who didn't prepare. Preparation isn't wrong, I said calmly, but replacing us without permission is. He nodded again. I see that now. We stood in silence for a moment. The kitchen light cast a soft glow across the counter. The same counter where Harold collapsed weeks ago. So much had shifted since then. And yet, everything looked the same. That's how power shifts often happen. Quietly. Without announcement. Later that week, Daniel invited us to his home for dinner. First time in months. His house felt different too. Less transactional. More lived in. He cooked himself, nothing elaborate. Pasta, salad, garlic bread. Halfway through the meal, he said something unexpected. I've been updating my own estate documents, he said. Harold raised an eyebrow. Already? He asked. Daniel smiled. Yes, but I added something new. What's that? I asked. A clause that requires dual consent for any major decision affecting both parties. Harold and I exchanged a look. That's wise, Harold said. Daniel nodded. I learned that recently. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The lesson had settled. After dinner, Daniel walked me to the car. Mom, he said softly, I don't want to become someone who manages people instead of loving them. I looked at him carefully. You won't, I said, if you remember the difference. He smiled. And if I forget? I'll remind you, I replied. He laughed quietly at that. There was no tension now. Just awareness. The following Sunday, as Harold trimmed the hedges again, I sat on the porch watching. The sprinkler system clicked on at its usual time. Routine. Predictable. But not rigid. Daniel arrived later that afternoon to help with a small repair in the garage. No documents. No proposals. Just tools. At one point, he paused and looked around the house. You built all this patiently, he said. Yes, I replied. I thought speed was strength. He admitted. It can be, I said, but not in every season. He nodded slowly. That was the real shift. Not cancellation of advisors. Not revised clauses. Understanding of timing. That evening, after Daniel left, Harold joined me in the study. Think we're past it? He asked. Yes, I said. Completely? No, I replied honestly. Because families don't erase tendencies. They adjust them. Daniel will always move quickly. We will always move deliberately. The balance isn't perfect. It's negotiated. But now it's conscious. I opened the desk drawer one last time and looked at the legal documents. Still secure. Still quiet. I didn't feel the need to review them anymore. Boundaries, once respected, don't need constant display. As I closed the drawer, I realized something simple. The night in the emergency room didn't reveal an affair. It revealed a difference in pace. And the moment I refused to be rushed, the dynamic changed. Not because I overpowered my son, but because I reminded him that authority in this house is shared until we choose otherwise. And that choice will always be ours. It has been 3 months since that night in the emergency room. 3 months since I stood under fluorescent lights and saw my name reduced to emergency contact. 3 months since I held a small black USB drive and realized the real emergency wasn't an affair. It was acceleration. Harold's health has stabilized. He walks every morning now, slower than before. Yes, but steady. He insists on carrying the newspaper back from the driveway himself. I'm not fragile, he reminds me. I know, I always answer. The house feels different these days. Not threatened. Not tense. Just grounded. The dining table has returned to its original purpose, meals. Crossword puzzles. The occasional stack of mail. No legal documents spread across it. No portfolios resting on the wood like quiet takeovers. Daniel still comes on Sundays. But he no longer arrives with plans. He arrives with questions. How are you both feeling this week? Need help with anything? Should we look at this together? Together. That word sounds different now. It carries consent. One afternoon, as I was organizing the hall closet, I found Harold's coat, the one he wore the night he collapsed. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket. Empty. The USB drive now sits locked in the study drawer with our updated documents. Not as a weapon, not as evidence waiting to be used. As a reminder. A reminder that clarity matters more than confrontation. A reminder that silence can be strategic. A reminder that love without boundaries turns into management. That evening, Daniel stayed later than usual. Harold had fallen asleep in his chair, television humming softly in the background. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen counter. Mom, he said quietly, I've been thinking about that night a lot. So have I replied. I really thought I was doing the responsible thing, he said, taking charge before things slipped. I know, I answered. He looked at his hands. I didn't realize taking charge could feel like taking over. There it was again. Understanding. You were afraid, I said gently, afraid of losing control, afraid of being too late. He nodded. And you were afraid of being replaced, he added. Yes, I said. We held each other's gaze for a long moment. Honesty does that. It steadies a room. I never want you to feel sidelined again, he said. And I never want you to feel shut out, I replied. That is the balance. Not authority over. Not authority under. Shared ground. A week later, Daniel brought over copies of his own revised estate plan. I added language about mutual consultation. He said, no unilateral decisions in my house either. I didn't ask him to do that. He chose it. Growth doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in repetition. In changed habits. In slowed pace. Sometimes I think back to the emergency room, to the way my name sat beneath his on that screen. Primary decision maker. Emergency contact. That hierarchy no longer exists in our home. Not because we erased him, but because we rebalanced. Last Sunday, Harold stood at the grill in the backyard while Daniel adjusted the patio umbrella. The air smelled like charcoal and cut grass. I watched them from the porch. Two men who love each other. Two men who almost collided over timing. Daniel looked over at me and smiled. Not strategic. Not assessing. Just smiling. In that moment, I understood something clearly. The real danger that night was never betrayal in the romantic sense. It was the quiet assumption that aging equals surrender. That fear justifies speed. That love grants automatic authority. But love, I've learned, requires conversation. Not control. If I had shouted, accused, or panicked, this story would have fractured. If Harold had signed quietly, this house would feel different. Instead, we chose clarity. We chose daylight over urgency. We chose to slow down. And because we slowed down, nothing was lost. The house remains ours. The decisions remain shared. The future remains deliberate. Sometimes strength is loud. But more often, it looks like this. A woman sitting at her own dining table, refusing to be quietly rearranged. A husband who records not to expose, but to protect. A son who learns that preparation without permission feels like displacement. That night in the emergency room, I thought I was about to uncover an affair. Instead, I uncovered something deeper. The importance of pace. The necessity of boundaries. And the quiet power of saying, calmly, no, not yet. And that was enough.